working our way through 7 men who rule the world from the grave. And we have talked now about, we're this morning on the 5th of those. And we talked about Charles Darwin, you remember, who changed the way we believe about origins. And I use we as in societal. We talked about Karl Marx, who changed the way we looked at necessity and value. We talked about Julius Wellhausen, who changed the way we looked at the scriptures. And last week, Sigmund Freud, who changed the way we look at ourselves. And then today we're going to talk about John Dewey, a name that you've probably heard of, though you may not be terribly familiar with his thinking. But I can promise you, like the rest of them, he has affected your life, even if his name's not as famous as some of the others. And probably most known, of course, for his decimal system, right? The Dewey decimal system that organized the library. The guy was brilliant in some form or fashion, I suppose. He was almost, you've heard the statement, a jack of all trades and a master of none. He was maybe the closest it came to be a master of all trades. At least he presented himself that way, and has been taken to believe that way. But he really messed up all trades in so many ways, and so we're going to consider him just a little bit. But let's consider, because maybe you've noticed a little pattern, that all of these people seem to be somewhere in the, say, 1850s to 1920s is when they're really making their greatest impact. And I think that's not just by accident. I think that all of the forces that be, if you would, that sounds rather unchristian, unbiblical, but the economic situation, the political situations around the world, all converged, if you will, to make that time a time in which it was possible to make great impact. So I have a feeling, and of course there's no way to prove this, but I have a feeling if you were to scatter these men out in different ages, that none of them would have made much of an impact. It is just that the society and the world around them was ripe at that point for some change that could take place. In fact, all of these men lived in the greatest era of change really the world has ever known, and it is the era that probably, say, close out the Civil War in 1863, and then go, or was it 1865? I've forgotten my history. 1860s anyway, close that out and go up to about World War I, 1917, and during that period of time was, in a sense, the greatest change that has ever come to man in the history of man. Even in our lifetimes, of course, we've had lots of changes, but most of what we've had in our lifetime is advancements on what came about during that period of time. And we've certainly advanced it to great degrees since that period of time. But the world really did fundamentally change during that time. And on the outline, I stretched it out a little bit, 1860 to 1940. And that was the time in which, I think the very first time, I guess this is obviously arguable, but for the very first time, Americans were able to spend their time thinking instead of working. And because they were able to spend their time thinking instead of working, there was lots of thinking going on. Now, not all of these people were Americans. John Dewey was. Some of the others were Europeans, and the same thing was happening in Europe to a certain degree, though Europe did have the privilege of having thinkers even before that. But in American history, when you come and you're building a country, there's no time to stop and think. You just have to build a society, build roads, build bridges. You can think about the government and the things there and do that, but that's about all you can do. It's only during times of luxury you can stop and think about philosophy and things like this. So what brought about is this time of social change was adopted in the nation, the people were looking, and even they were calling it the beginning of a new day. They recognized that this is an unbelievable, fundamental time. I don't think, if you were to take a poll of Americans today, I don't think very many of them would say this is the start of a great new day. I think they would say, I don't know what's going on in our world. I think they might say, we're headed to hell in a handbasket. They might say things are going downhill. I'm worried about tomorrow. But in that, post-Civil War up until maybe World War I, but definitely, even after that, you got the Roaring '20s and all of that kind of stuff, and there was just great hope for tomorrow. And all of this was adopted into the church, which at that time really began to abandon its historic roots of salvation through Jesus Christ alone. And as they began to abandon all of this, the church adopted, during that time more than any, they adopted a social gospel. And they adopted it very strongly. Now, we're not talking about the churches that dotted the landscape that were fundamental Bible-teaching churches. There were always those, and there still are today, and those churches teach the gospel. But when I say the church like that, I really mean the academia of the church, the thinkers of the church, the higher echelon of the church, the writers of the church, the leaders of the church. They all adopted this social gospel. Now, where did they adopt this social gospel from? Well, first of all, they adopted the social gospel from the world around them, because the world around them was saying, we have evolved to a new age. Now, the workers of the world can unite. They no longer have to be those terrible little minions, yes. They don't have to be the minions anymore. There'll be economic justice for everybody, and the kingdom is now, not something future because we don't read the Bible like that anymore. Now we realize the kingdom is in our heart. And so the church adopted during that time something, as you know, called postmillennialism. And postmillennialism is, we're going to build the kingdom and we're going to so improve this world that Jesus Christ would be pleased to come back to it. That was obviously a very optimistic, even utopian worldview. And it's a worldview that I think is very much coming back into the church today, by the way. But interestingly enough, many of our hymns were written during that era. And so a lot of our hymns do have this sort of social gospel utopian kind of build the kingdom post-millennialism built into them. And we don't even necessarily realize it. Some of the easiest ones to see are for example, stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory, his armies shall we lead, till every what? Foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Now, we sing that all the time, and we don't really think about it being, take over the world and build a kingdom and postmillennialism, but it's from that era, and it very much was, if we come together as an army, we can vanquish every foe. That is, we can defeat the enemy. We can do it through economic advancements, through social advancements, through educational advancements, and it was this social gospel that took over and took place. I have before, and I won't get into it too much, but I could probably give you a dozen hymns that we regularly sing that are that kind of, really, if you begin to think of them, that kind of a social gospel type thing. So this onward Christian soldiers, marching is to war. That's right. In fact, World War I was the start of the end of that era, because what they thought was going to turn into utopia didn't. But even after World War I, you remember, they called it the war to end all wars. So we're done with war. That's a thing of the past now. And then the worst war of the world of history has ever known came about after that. And after World War II and the atomic bomb and all that kind of stuff, the utopian vision was pretty much gone. That's when they went from postmillennialism to amillennialism. They should have thought a little farther and just gone to premillennialism, but they didn't. Now, this was the kind of period of time. Now, prior to that time, let's talk about education today with John Dewey. Prior to that time, education, let's say the 1850s, education was what we would pretty much call classical education. Beginning in the 1850s, it started changing into what today is called modern education and what is used today. John Dewey was the biggest thinker behind modern education, even though it somewhat started before him. But man, he took it and he ran with it till 1939, so that modern education today really is Deweyism. And he began to take this. You know, during this period of time that we were talking about, beginning in, say, the 1850s, the church, or the society, I should say, Western thinking, became, I'll use the word godless. And I don't mean that in terms of full of sin. I mean that in terms of there's just no discussion of God in the matter. So economics didn't come to what does God say about this matter. It came to, well, what's human need, what produces value, all those kind of things that would be a discussion of economics. But prior to this period of time, a God-filled thinking ruled what you did in economics, and a God-filled thinking ruled what you did in science, and on and on. In fact, you go back to many of these olden days of Isaac Newton and his Kepler, Johann Kepler, and all those great scientists and explorers and astronomers of the world. And you'll find they also wrote these long treatises on theology, because they were theologians who were trying to figure out from theology, how does science work? From theology, how does the astronomy work? On and on. Now, that began to change. In fact, here is from 1655, obviously a little bit earlier, but from 1655, Harvard University had this statement. I kept it in their own spelling of 1655. In the first year after admission, for 4 days of the week, all students shall be exercised in the study of the Greek and Hebrew tongues. Now, freshmen at Harvard, 4 days a week studying for a year Greek and Hebrew. And then they had Greek and Hebrew all the way through the entire 4 years of their college career. They could not go to Harvard University without Greek and Hebrew. Why not? Because the Bible's written in Greek and Hebrew. And they understood at that time, the thinking was, if you cannot understand the Bible, you cannot understand economics and science and all these other things, because you've got to start with, there is a God who is the ultimate reality. He is the creator. So what does God have to say about the matter? And you better have that foundation first before you lead into the other. Well, that began to go away. And I read an article actually last night. It was written in 1971 from the Harvard Crimson. In fact, I think that's where I got that. I quoted here a little bit, didn't I? It says this trend, it's interesting that the Harvard Crimson's, I'm sure misspelled the word. I think they meant trend there. This trend towards abolition or reduction of the language requirement cummed for several reasons. I did copy this straight off their website, by the way, but leave it to Harvard. Dean Edward Sullivan of Princeton, where the language requirement was doubled a few years ago, points out that there is a growing opposition to academic restraints in general. He says that the foreign language requirement is the first to be assaulted because it is likely to be the rigorous and most visible. Another reason which Bollinger points out is that the student who learns in a language against his will is likely to bring down the level of the class. This unwillingness can stem from dislike of the language learning process or from deeply rooted mental blocks. Does that sound a little bit Freudian? We're going to show in a minute how it's Dewey also. Finally, he says, there is the case of the student who simply finds it extremely difficult to learn a foreign language, but has no legitimate reason for exemption. Although he may be very conscientious and spend a vastly disproportionate amount of time studying for his class, he is unable to complete the coursework competently. The student's other classes may suffer from his lack of attention. This raises the question of whether or not it is fair to require such a student to learn a foreign language. Now, let me back up there. 1655, you don't get into Harvard without spending 4 days a week in Greek and Hebrew. And you... They did have a lot of 14, 15-year-olds in Harvard. That's right. And it was very common for people who didn't go to Harvard to study Greek and Hebrew. And not only that, they had to speak Latin too, but it was assumed they would already know Latin before they got there because Latin was taught in grammar school. And so all of this was taught for the purpose of being able to understand the truth. Now that really is where foreign language requirements came into education today. You wonder why do you have to take 2 years of Spanish? Because it started out you had to study Greek and Hebrew. Well, then they began to broaden that. Well, you need to be able to study another language just because it helps your mind. And then, well, you need 2 years of something. Now here in this article, and again, this is dated 1971. But what you notice the focus of this article is on what? The lazy student, that's right. He might have a mental block. It might cause him to spend an inordinate amount of time studying his French class when he could be changing the world by studying science. It's pragmatism, it is student-oriented, rather than classical education, if I can put it kind of bluntly, says, go whine on your own time. We don't care. Here's the facts, and you got to learn them. So it was very fact-based. Dewey came along, and again, he just jumped on the train and became the engineer. But Dewey came along and said, if I can just jump ahead to the story a little bit, he said, well, there's not really such a thing as facts anyway. Everything is fluid, everything changes, and so we just need to equip a student to make the greatest impact in his world. It was, I think, again, this trend away from understanding there is a God and we need to know what he has to say. That was the basis of education, even public education prior to the point of John Dewey. And then it became, through all these other forces, it became godless and student-oriented and basically trying to make the student feel good about himself or herself so that when they graduate, you know, they can have self-actualization and, you know, understand what they are. So here comes Dewey then in all of this picture and this stretch that comes along, and he begins to address the situation, especially as it relates to languages. Dewey became a professor. He was born in Vermont and hit during his professorships all the big schools of the day. He ended at Columbia University as the chair of the Department of something distinguished sounding that related to education and philosophy and a broad range of things that took place. So you got this trend towards godlessness that was coming about, and then you've got this guy at the front of the train who more than anyone else, advances the godlessness of society. How did the ideas of, especially Wellhausen and Charles Darwin and Karl Marx, how did they root themselves in society so quickly? Society that for hundreds of years had held to these classical views. And all of a sudden, really, you could almost say in a generation, definitely 2, 3 generations, the world is thinking completely differently. How did it happen? I'm convinced it happened through public education. And Dewey recognized that it's the public education that can mold the society in the future. And this is exactly what happened. Now, most of us are some sort of a result of public education. And so it can be a little difficult for us because we look back and say, well, you know, it's fine for me. One of the things I would ask you, though, is what about all the other students you went to school with? Are you different from them? And my hunch is you probably are. There's probably some like you, but you may have grown up in an especially conservative community or an especially religious family, or maybe somewhere along the way you had an experience in which you saw the light. But I think that public education has affected all of us, even those who didn't go to public education, and what a tool it is to influence society and literally change the world. Deweyism is a pragmatism, and pragmatism, of course, is if it works, do it. And so Dewey, as a pragmatist, one thing a pragmatist never does is stop changing. A pragmatist is always going to change, which makes Dewey very hard to read, by the way, because not believing there is an essential truth or an ultimate reality, he's all over the map. He argues this side, he argues that side, he's against you on this point, but he won't take the opposite point. You can never pin him down. You read one book and he says this, you read another book and he says that, and he just goes all over the place because he's a pragmatist. Or he might call himself an experimentalist, in a sense maybe an idealist. His idea was that the truth is out there, but it doesn't matter because you can't find it. So what matters is, what does it mean to you? How is it going to affect you? If you do A, is it going to give you the result that you want? And so you begin to carry all this pragmatism out. I think this pragmatism that has so been rooted in public education has come to maybe full fruit here in our society today. Who would have guessed, let's say, definitely 10 years ago, but I think you could probably even go 5 years ago, that you would hear the term gender fluidity, if you know what that means. And that means that gender is not X, Y chromosomes, what is it, 23 of them, I'm one, and 20 something, I forgot that science, but when I was growing up, at least that's what they taught. You're a male if you have this many, you're a female if you have that many, it's all chromosomal. Now it is, gender is determined how? Yeah, how you feel. Yeah, exactly. What do you want to be? How do you feel? What do you sense about yourself? And it's even, it started out this continuum between male and female, but now it's well beyond that. I saw some article the other day about someone whose gender was a sexless alien. The sad part is, I don't even think he was joking. I think this is just how he feels about himself. And he's carrying out surgeries and whatnot to create him into this. Now, where does such stupid thinking come from? I think it's an ultimate kind of pragmatism a little bit that just goes to roots, like whatever feels, whatever works in one situation. Now, churches have bought into this pragmatism, I think. You remember the old saying that, again, this sounded good when we started saying it, but the old saying that was in the church is, never change your message, but always change your... Anybody remember that? Maybe it's just preachers that heard it. Your tithe, yeah. Never change your message, but always change your methods. Your methods. Now, that was a pragmatism kind of statement. It at least tried to root itself in the message, but every time when they said that, what they meant is, we've got to do things differently. We can't do things like we did in the past. And so they added a new method, a new thing, a new something, a new this, a new that. And I remember back in the, probably 90s, I was a pastor. There was a campaign that was out within Southern Baptists, even had little buttons and all this kind of stuff that said, start something new. Start something new. And every church and every pastor and everybody was encouraged to start something new. That's a pragmatism idea that says, let's not do things the way we've always done things before. I think, I know I probably sound like an old fogey here, but I think that probably what we should have done as churches is rather than start something new, we should have said, we need to build the thinking foundation that tells why we're doing what we're doing. There was a reason for doing what we were doing. There was a purpose in doing what we're doing. And we abandoned all of that, and we've ended up with a mess. Honestly, I wrote an article just this week on why church funding should not be supported financially. And basically I said it's you're pouring money down a black hole into a rat's nest when you do it. But because it's honestly just an utter failure. But what it's also doing, in fact, I'll talk locally here about that article, and I'll get back to Dewey in a moment. You go up to the Indian church right here, and on the, what do you call it, cornerstone, it says something like, paid for by the Home Mission Board, 1951. I tell you, what is now the Home Mission Board today would not give 10 cents to do ministry in a rural area like this, not 10 cents. $78 million they give to start churches in about 12 cities that already have a whole bunch of churches in them, if you go look. Now, it's not anymore about, let's go to the places where you need a full-time career missionary. It is, let's start something new because, who cares about where you need all that? Now, we have a ministry here that's gone on for all these years because there were at that time full-time career missionaries carrying it out. There are no full-time career missionaries anymore. Now, we got this continual change that goes along, and we bring this out, and what does it come from? Well, I think it begins with Dewey's idea that there was no absolute truth. If there's no absolute truth, then doing what you've always been doing doesn't make any sense, does it? Why do that? And all of that, when we go back and analyze it, all that we used to do, we used to learn, we used to teach, was based upon facts. Just teach facts. Here's the facts as we know it. Now, as you know, I'm a skeptic, so I think we always ought to question our facts, make sure we have our facts right, because somewhere along the way, we do come, even at our age, right? We do come and say, oh, I used to think that the facts were such and such, but now I recognize. And of course, we change based upon the what? The facts. Dewey says there are no facts. So you change based upon what works, what needs done, what's going to happen. And so it's that pragmatism. And so he took, as I sort of mentioned earlier, he took almost every position you could take on a subject. He took it. I remember, you all remember Gilligan's Island, don't you? It was a great classic television. And I remember one episode in Gilligan's Island that had Gilligan dealing with some sort of issue on the island, and people were coming to him. There's only, 7 of them, but the others were coming to him one at a time and, laying out the facts, and then someone else would come and lay out the other facts, and Gilligan through the whole thing was saying, well, this is true, but on the other hand, and Dewey just had lots of other hands. It just continually went on the other hand, because there was no absolute truth, and so his position was circumstantial, which is exactly what is taught today. With truth is just do that which is circumstantially true. And reality for him, or truth, I guess you could say, reality for him was just out there somewhere. It was some mix of the facts all brought together on a particular subject. So again, everything was provisional and experimental. Now, he was a prolific writer. He wrote and 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 he wrote. There is one bibliography that just the listing of his writings was 150 pages for the bibliography. So the guy wrote so much, in fact, that just because he had this vast ream of writings, he was considered an expert. And you can do that, right? If you just write a whole bunch, people consider, well, you must know what you're talking about. And so he did that. It reminded me when I was thinking of this, how we look at Dewey as an expert because he wrote so much, whether or not there's any truth to it, or whether or not he had any kind of consistency to him, he still wrote a bunch. And so as I was thinking about him, I thought about, once again, my favorite musical, Fiddler on the Roof. Uh, and you remember Tevye as he's in the barn feeding the chickens one day, and he looks up at God and he says, something like, "I know it's not a shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either." He talks to God a little bit, and then he begins, "If I were a rich man," and dreaming all the things about, if I were a rich man, and all the nice houses he'd had in the center of the town, and one staircase going up and one coming down and one going nowhere just for show. If I were a rich man. Well, he has a couple of good things that show a lot of Judaism in it. But one of the things he says, if I were a rich man, he talks about how he could study the good book all day long. And that was Judeo-Christian thinking, and I put the Christian side of it as well, because prior to, again, this revolution that came about, it was the greatest honor in life was to be able to spend your time studying the Word of God and its implications in society. And so Tevye kind of wishes for this. But he also talks about, and this is the point that matters here, he talks about, I'll just quote a little bit. He says, "The most important men in town would come to fawn on me. They would ask me to advise them, like Solomon the Wise, posing problems that would cross a rabbi's eyes. And it won't make one bit of difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know." How true that is. And not only when you're rich do they think you really know, but when you write a whole bunch of stuff, they think you really know. So Dewey was considered an expert because he wrote a bunch of stuff. Now, he had this disdain for classical education. And let me read a quote out of the book here. Let's see, because it will show you, I think, a little bit of the disdain that he had for classical education, which I'll describe in a moment if you're wondering about it. Here we go. Part of the reason is found in the educational tradition itself. Elementary schooling was everywhere in the past devoted to the promotion of literacy. It was identified with acquiring skills in reading, writing, and he said figuring. Reading, writing, and figuring. I'll just stop right there. He agrees, and that was and is classical education. It is based upon the promotion of literacy. If you can read and you can write and you can figure, that is, do the math, then with that fundamental set of abilities in reading, writing, and arithmetic, then you were able to logically make some conclusions based upon what? The truth of those facts. And you nailed those facts down so that you could logically, connect the dots and make good conclusions. And then the ultimate in classical education was, now that you have the facts and you can logically connect the dots, can you persuade others? Rhetoric, they called it. So the ability to stand and persuade others toward this degree, this logic based upon this facts. That was the whole goal of classical education. So classical education was identified with acquiring the skills of reading, writing, and figuring. Our ancestors would have possessed an uncanny insight and imagination if they had thought that the purpose of the common school in any other traditional terms. Let me parse that out. Our ancestors would have been brilliant had they rejected that. But they weren't with the times. They just thought reading, writing, and figuring was it. And if they had foresight, they would have been uncanny beyond their peers to recognize the flaws in this. He goes on to say, higher education, that he was talking about elementary education. He says higher education was almost equally controlled by the concern for symbols, namely advanced mathematics and foreign languages. Now, he was bemoaning this fact. Back in the day, higher education was way too concerned with facts, if I can paraphrase that for you. In fact, he uses the word control. Higher education was almost equally controlled by the concern for symbols, namely advanced mathematics and figures. Now, as he goes on to argue, and as Dewey would do, he argues that facts are not important. What matters is what can a student do in society? What kind of impact can they make? What kind of changes can they make? How can they feel about themselves? And carry that out. So the reason he hated classical education was that it was based upon dogma. And dogma was a sentence has to have a subject and a verb. That's dogma. And he didn't think that schools ought to focus on dogma. What schools ought to do is focus on social change. And he spearheaded the effort to make schools instruments of social change. Now, here's the problem. If you have, say, classical education, and you teach dogma, here's a whole bunch of facts, then what kind of change does that bring into the future? Now, let me back up there, because I think if we began to teach facts today, it would make a great change for the future, wouldn't it? But let's suppose we're in 1850, and this is the way it's always been done. Now, if we continue the next generation, we teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic, what kind of societal change is that going to bring? None. They're going to keep the things the way they are because there's a reason for the way they are. They're going to make the same logical conclusions. So if you keep doing the same thing, you're going to keep what? Getting the same results. So Dewey came along and said, we need different results. We've got to have social change. And so he recognized you've got to change education. I remember when I was growing up, my mother and all her generation was talking about when we were in elementary school. They were saying, I just don't understand this new math. Okay, I don't understand this new math. Now, I remember then when I was raising a boy and a girl, and they were in elementary school, I was saying, I just don't understand this new math. And today, I see things about, I just don't understand this new math that they call Common Core. Now, what is it about math that has changed several times over the generations? Even from when I was growing up in elementary school in the 70s to where when my kids were in elementary school in the 90s, and to the kid who today is in elementary school, I promise you, some of the math problems, you and I can't even figure out where they're going or how they're getting there. It's just, we look at it and say, oh, I know the answer, but I have no clue what you're teaching. Now, why does the teaching of math change? It's facts, right? I think it changes because, first of all, education, public education, at least from the time I was in, and I'm sure going back at least to Dewey's day, it's always changing the method, and really, in a sense, it's because the facts don't matter. What matters is we've got to affect your thinking process. And don't be fooled to think there's not some agenda behind getting a person to think along this path. Because if I can get them to think along this path, then I can bring about this particular answer. What do you call that old little toy that you'd spin? Yeah. And what do you call this? What sound is that? What do you call an old man? Pop. Okay. So, we got the top, we got the pop. I should go longer, but I don't have time. And what do you do when you're driving down the road and you come to the green light? Aha! Why do you stop at a green light? Okay, now, what I did was I conditioned your thinking. Now, That was Dewey's idea, is we've got to condition the thinking so that when they come here to this point, they'll just spit out the answer. And it's worked perfectly down through the years in the social change, because that was at the bottom of it all. Dewey believed public education was not an institution for the facts, it was an institution for social change. Now, no parent is going to be satisfied if you don't give them some facts, so let's figure out how to give them the facts in a manner that brings about social change. So often what we have today, like that Harvard article in 1971, is, this focus on foreign languages, it hinders the thinking of some people, it hurts them, and so we're going to teach them a different set of facts. We're not going to require this of them anymore. And that affects, again, the way we think about things. Or when it comes to teaching history today, a lot of what teaching history is, here's something that happened. How do you feel about that? What does it mean to you? I remember even growing up, and I always hated these, when we were taught poetry, and we would get these poems about, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled. Now, what does that mean to you? How does that make you feel? Just describe a time that you took a road less traveled and all this kind of stuff, rather than here's the circumstances in which Robert Frost was writing, here's the rhythm and the rhyme that he used, here's the method of developing that poetry. I don't think it's any surprise today that nobody can write poetry, and people used to be able to write poetry, because you used to have all these grammatical facts that were given in such a strong way. Well, here's I'm out of time, but here's a summary of Dewey thinking. Final truth is illusory. He rejected what C.S. Lewis called the doctrine of objective value. There is no objective value. We're just trying to be an instrument of social change. You talk about now I'm getting ahead of myself. Number 2 on the summary. We should not concern ourselves with truth, but rather with meaning. I almost don't even know what that means, but he said it over and over, that we deal with meaning, not with truth. And meaning is how we interact with the truth. So again, in the history example, doesn't really matter what happened in 1492. It is how do we interact with what happened in 1492. Has anyone noticed there's an issue with Columbus Day today? Why is there an issue with Columbus Day today? We're not concerned with what happened, the facts of 1492. We're concerned with our interaction with the facts. And so that becomes priority in the world today. The third one, truth is resident in experience. And because truth is resident in experience, think about that. Truth is not resident in and of itself. Truth is not something that you can search and discover. Truth is the experience of it all. So Dewey hated the lecture method, and that even affected the church. And I think affects the church more and more today, because preaching is something that's going out the window. And why is preaching going out the window? Well, because that is a lecture method. And people don't learn from lecture methods. People drift off and they go to sleep and all these other kind of things that they'll tell us. And so pastors are supposed to show videos, have a drama, and sit on a stool and have a 5-minute conversation, and then you're supposed to light a candle or twist a pipe cleaner or something with the experience. There's a church in Houston that has, at the church, there's places where you can go during the service and paint, and there's Play-Doh stations and all this, where you can interact with the spirit that is going on there around you. It's Deweyism is what it is. The fourth one, teaching depends on experiment. The problem is our kids are the experiment. And this is what's happening in Common Core education. Hey, here's a new experiment. Let's try this one. What it always means, by the way, is we're not getting the social change we'd like to see. So here's a method that will bring social change much better. And a controversial one still today is the experiment of school busing. School busing had nothing to do with reading, writing, and figuring, did it? School busing had to do with a sociologist's understanding of how to bring about change in society. And so the powers that be in academia or in government or wherever it was gathered together, and based upon, not on facts, on some arbitrary figure, they decided that a school should be made up of these certain characteristics. In that day it was racially. So they would take a child all the way over from the other end of town, bus him all the way across. Why? For a social experiment. Because this is the way to end racism. Now, I don't have a problem with saying that racism is not a good thing for society. Racism is not something that honor God. Racism is inherently selfish, all the things that we could say. But we could have taught the issues of racism based upon facts, couldn't we? Right there in their own neighborhood, in their own school, without this crazy experiment of shifting people all over. So you got 32% of this race and 33% of that race, and and get it all perfected like this. That was Deweyism. And then finally, religion needs to be transformed to serve mankind. This is one that the church has bought into again, unfortunately. He didn't have a problem with Christianity so long as Christianity was serving mankind. If Christianity was feeding people, clothing people, educating people in Deweyism, all of that, if it was an instrument for social action, then he was all for it. But if the church was going to be about dogma, then he's not for that. He didn't want anything to do with the dogma of Christianity. And I think the church, again, has almost wholesale bought into this idea that the church's mission is to improve the society around them. In fact, I would encourage you sometime, take a little study. I've never done this scientifically. It would be fun to do. But look today at what is called mission trips and mission projects. We can see this in our own community and church, because we have groups that come here to do mission trips. I tell you, as a pastor, I could have probably 30 groups every summer. I turned down most of them because it makes me go bald. Trying to manage all of, you got 20 kids that come in, and what is it that all of them call and want to do? Mission work. Which typically is, we'll paint something, we'll pull weeds, we'll feed, we'll clothe, all of these things. That nothing inherently wrong with those, is it? But nobody ever calls to say, can we do door-to-door evangelism? Could we maybe stand in the plaza and give out gospel tracts? Could we have a week-long discipleship class? It's never sharing a witness of Jesus Christ. It's always all these nice things. And that's what mission work has become, and did a number of years ago. And again, we have some groups here that come and help us out in those things, and they're practical things that do need to be done. But wouldn't you agree with me that all that social action work that we've done, whether it's here or somewhere else, has been a great big bust in terms of evangelism? I'm not saying don't do it. I think you ought to do it. I think you ought to be nice to people. It's called humanitarianism, and all of you are humans, 90% of you. We ought to be humanitarian, but we put so much money, so much time, so much effort into all these things, and guess what? Here we are, same group of people as last year, as the year before, as the year before, right? Because it's not really winning people to the Lord, is it? It's giving somebody a meal. It's painting their house. It's pulling their weed, whatever. And I've also discovered, by the way, in fact, I saw this last night. Did anyone see? Is it Waters World? Is that the name of the show? Jesse Waters on Fox News. Seems like a delightful young man, but he had a little segment on spring break, and he talked about the spring break party you haven't heard of. Of course, he contrasted, all the drinking and everything that goes on down at the beach, spring break. And then he went, I think it was to West Virginia, and he talked to this group of college students from, I believe it was the University of Delaware, and they were working on houses. And he talked to them about, why they're working on houses. Now, this was not a religious group. It was just a student group that was out working on houses. Had, as far as I could tell, absolutely nothing to do with religion. And yet, it's the very same thing all of our mission trips would have gone to do. And we have a group of people here, had a group of people here last year, AmeriCorps. Those kids in AmeriCorps, guess what they're doing? The very same thing all our kids would go be doing on a mission trip. Nice, good work, working hard, giving to society, all that. But it's all secular, humanism. Now, my point is, that's nice, but that's not missions. And missions, I'm convinced, really has to do with dogma. You got to come back to that dogma. And Dewey said, hey, let's get the churches to do missions. Digging water wells and pulling weeds and fixing houses and building, screened-in porch, whatever, all of that. And if we occupy them doing that, then they won't really confront someone with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Again, the truth is, the results of it have just been, I think you could say none. In terms of evangelistic baptism kind of growing disciples that remain kind of work. So I have another 20 minutes. I'd like to rant about that, but it would be preaching time by then. So go out and do your humanitarian work, and God bless you. As we do missions, we'll figure out a different means of that. Let's pray together.